So I'm Keith McHenry, one of the 8 college-age students that started Food Not Bombs on May 24th, 1980. And it started because, and it's that date, because one of the 8 of us, Brian Feigenbaum, was arrested. And we had to raise money to bail him out. We did. And we wanted to pay the person back. So we thought we would do bake sales. Turned out you can't make much money doing bake sales, but we had a moving company called Smooth Move, so we're moving this family. And we got a poster that said, wouldn't it be a beautiful day if the schools had all the money they needed and the Air Force had to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber. So we dressed up as soldiers and we mounted the poster on cardboard and did our bake sales. And that became the inspiration ultimately to be a street theater group, which is what we started out doing. And the first big theatrical thing after that was we did a soup line in front of the stockholders meeting of the Bank of Boston at the Federal Reserve Bank. And we realized we hadn't got enough people. This was in March 26, 1981, about a month after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. And so we didn't have enough friends dressed up as hobos to say, hey, the policies of Reagan could lead to a Great Depression and so on. So I went to the homeless shelter, Pine Street Inn, and gave a little speech about this protest. And they were like so excited, a bunch of them, like, oh, protest like the 60s. And they showed up and they said, you should do this every day. We have no food for homeless people in Boston. So that night we decided we would quit our jobs, give 2 weeks notice, and do nothing but collect food that couldn't be thrown out, and that was being thrown out. I was working at a produce market. I was in a produce department of Bread and Circus in Cambridge, and I'd been taking produce to the housing projects a few blocks away, where one day the mothers that I was getting the food said, oh, look, they just opened this new building across the street where they're designing nuclear weapons, and that's where the name came from. So after the 8 years of doing Food Not Bombs in San Francisco, collecting food that couldn't be sold from grocery stores, bakeries, and so on, I ended up moving to San Francisco. Thought it was like the most liberal city in America. My grandparents are from here, from Santa Cruz, and they'd taken me there for years. And we met the hippies in the '60s. We even saw the Diggers back in those days. It was a famous theater group that Peter Coyote might be the most famous member of. And so we're serving food at the end of Haight Street on the day that there was no other food in the Haight-Ashbury. And there was a suggestion that we get a permit. So I wrote for a permit. 30 days later, riot police came out of the park and arrested 9 of us. And that ultimately became a global movement because people would be so outraged that we were being arrested there, and it would make the news. And I made a little flyer saying 7 steps to starting Food Not Bombs. And this is before the internet and all that. So I would mail it to you. And so slowly group after group got going. We were arrested a total of 1,000 times in San Francisco. I was arrested 94 times. And according to the district attorney, when I settled the 3 strikes case, they gave me credit for time served of 500 days. And so that just expanded Food Not Bombs worldwide. And then the punk scene was really into it because all these arrests and everything and us resisting, and we had like these logistical patterns that we did, like coming in with little empty buckets basically and getting arrested. And after the second arrest, we would come in with real food, and we had risk arrest one day a month with Food Not Bombs and things like that. And MDC was one of our house bands, Millions of Dead Cops, and they would raise money to help replace the equipment the police stole and everything. And it just became a phenomena. And so punk bands would tour the world and do Food Not Bombs. And so consequently today, we are in at least 1,000 cities, maybe even 1,500 cities. And it's like tens of thousands of people do Food Not Bombs all over the world. Currently, Myanmar earthquake, we have Food Not Bombs chapters there, and the Thai chapters are helping with the relief effort. We're the only food in New Orleans for every day for 8 months after Katrina. We've fed people after Sandy, so we've done a lot of relief work as well. And then, of course, we're most, besides feeding the hungry in city parks, we are most famous also for serving food at protests. And we've done like Earth First protests, rendezvous, and tree sits, and we've done a lot of work with Big Mountain, with Danae and the Hopi, and we're really tight with Aboriginal people because we were really the only like Europeans helping Aboriginal people in their struggles and so on. So that's the condensed history of Food Not Bombs. Green Day, when they were just a Gilman Street band, ate with us. And then eventually Green Day started cooking with East Bay Food Not Bombs. And then when they signed the label and had a stadium event in Oakland, they actually gave money to East Bay Food Not Bombs, San Francisco Food Not Bombs, and the San Francisco Coalition of the Homeless. So it was the proceeds from the very first stadium concert they did. So I had kind of a yin-yang grandfathers. One was my father's father. He was a park ranger. And on the way to be the first park ranger, one of the first park rangers at the Grand Canyon, he crashed. And some Hopi elders found him, or Hopis, I don't know if they're elders, but Hopis, they were elders when I met him. They took them back to Old Arribe, which is the oldest continually inhabited village in the United States. And he convalesced there, and he became friends with the families there. And he actually took the only known photo in an active kiva in the kiva at Old Arribe. So when I was a child, and my father working at the Grand Canyon, my father was a ranger, and so I lived in national parks for my childhood. And my grandparents would take us out to meet his friends at Old Arribe and at the other mesas in Hopi Land. And we would also picnic at the brand new town that was made, or on the edge of Page, Arizona, where the workers were living to build Glen Canyon Dam. So my family went before Lake Powell was flooded, and we were I was super moved by the snake dances. I was a kindergartner. No, I was first and second grade. When the first 2 years I went to Old Arribe and watched the snake dances and the green corn dances, and there was no electricity out there anymore. It was just as it had been for centuries. So then when I was 16 years old, I was a lot of ranger kids were going to this school. They don't go anymore there because it's too expensive. But back at the time, it was cheap, Presbyterian school in Wasatch Academy in Mount Pleasant, Utah. So I was up on top of the Wasatch Mountains, and I'm looking down, and I see all this black smoke coming up the valleys. And I realized, that's from the coal generating power plant at Shiprock. And they were strip mining, the Hopi land, and I would go on, US 89 down to like Flagstaff to visit friends and to Sedona to visit friends and stuff like that back in those days. And I was just horrified at the desecration of this sacred land by these corporations. So that was the moment I decided to dedicate my life to ending corporate power. But also, or even earlier than that, shortly after I was visiting the Hopi with my family, we moved to Shenandoah National Park, and my father gave me a copy of Walden by Thoreau. So I was probably in the fifth grade, and I just had learned to read because I have dyslexia. And so I said, well, I don't want to, this is my first adult book. So I read On the Duty to Civil Disobedience, which was in the back of the Penguin edition, paperback edition that I had. And that totally transformed my life too. And so the Vietnam War is happening at that time. And that's what you would have dinner every night and watch how many Viet Cong were killed versus how many Americans were killed, like you're watching sports or something. It was really gruesome. And so those were kind of the things that led me to become a revolutionary and to just dedicate my life to doing that. My father's father was in the trenches in Belgium during World War One as a medic. The other grandfather, my mom's father, John Phelan, was in an intelligence organization out of Harvard, which he didn't make real clear what that was at the beginning. The predated the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. Then he was in the Office of Strategic Services, and he was assigned to Burma. And he directed the most deadly bombing campaign in world history, even to this day, which was Operation Meeting House, which was the firebombing of Tokyo. And I would go to the reunions of his squadron reunions and meet the pilots and the gunners and bombardiers and so on, and listen to their conversations. But also, when my family visited him in Needham, Massachusetts, he would, or on Cape Cod, because he had a farm on Cape Cod, he would teach me about reality, real politics. So even as young as 6 years old, he was showing me how to fish. And when I caught a perch, you've got to put him out of his misery and kill him. And then he was telling me how, I would grow up to have to determine who would live and who would die. That was white man's burden. That's what he called it. And he also explained that the elections were designed specifically to divide and conquer the population so there would be never a threat to the people in power. And that the intelligence community was responsible for determining who was in power and who was not. And then I also watched him for years, maybe 3 years during the Vietnam War. We'd be at his house in Needham, Massachusetts, and he'd be on the phone with Curtis LeMay, which was one of his closest friends, and with Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, arguing to drop the atomic bomb on Hanoi to send a message to the communists. That wasn't about defeating. He had no interest in defeating Vietnam necessarily. The idea was we had to contain communism at any, cost, because the most important thing was not democracy. He had, said there is no democracy. That's not going to ever happen. But to defend the people in power and to defend corporate power. And that was his whole point of view. So it was pretty outrageous that I would watch him argue. We'd be supposedly having Christmas or some Easter or some holiday, and here he is wanting to drop an atomic bomb on Hanoi. The other thing he'd explained is that, and this is where I have a hint that he was in an intelligence organization before World War II in the Army of some nature. That, to me, was never made clear. But he explained how they provoked Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor, and why they moved all the ships to Pearl Harbor. And he said over and over again for years, we had to do it. Otherwise, the American people would never get involved in a war in the Pacific. And he even had a cousin that was killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. But he said, yeah, it's what you got to do to defend our interests. And he died when I was 14. I spent the last summer between the last year of 8th grade living with him in Needham. And he had also explained that he was in a satanic organization. So his trajectory was he was Phillips Andover to Dartmouth College to Harvard Law. And somewhere along that line, he joined this satanic group. Man, what's really stood out was when he died, which was in my freshman year in high school. His second wife had his funeral at a congregational church in Needham, and the pastor was talking what a godly person he was and everything, and that's where it really hit me. These people are scum. He said there was no God, and that he was in a satanic organization. I don't know why these people are coming off saying he was some godly Christian guy, because he wasn't. Now, if that I had not been at his funeral and the pastor was saying that, I wouldn't have been so dramatic, my belief that he was in this satanic group. But that just, at 14 years old, hearing that, I was like, wow, that's intense. So, he had said that many times during the time, growing up. And he had pictures, 63 black and white photos that he took of the firebombing of Tokyo framed in his den, and the den where he'd be on the phone yelling at McNamara and Curtis LeMay. And what I did not know, being a kid, was that Curtis LeMay was also proposing to John F. Kennedy that they do a false flag in a mall in Miami and blame it on Castro to justify invading Cuba. So my grandfather's friends were really into false flags because they did at least tried to do two, and they succeeded at one, which was Pearl Harbor. Yeah, I just thought it was cold, just reality. I was not very emotional about it. He wasn't emotional about it. And I thought, well, okay, that's how everything works. But I don't recall being really, I did think it was a little gruesome. You would kill a lot of people, but I thought, well, maybe people have to kill a lot of people. My grandfather says you have to kill a lot of people. So yeah, it was and I think that emotion that I had, is one of the reasons I can be so involved in analyzing the news and politics and not be freaked out like almost everybody else would have as much knowledge as me. Would be like, my girlfriend, she's like, oh, we can't, let's stop watching, videos on the wars and stuff. It's too much for me to take. I could just watch them endlessly because it doesn't like, yeah, I've got this like kind of sadly in a way, a cold analysis of what is going on. I think it's morally wrong and horrible, and I just can't, believe that anybody could justify these things. But I do know that people justify them. That people in power right now, are like my grandfather, right? And it's just cold analytics. We have this goal, which is defending the rulers, and that's what we got to do. Real politics. On my dad's side, the park ranger, he was that side. I think this is the only reason that my mother's father let my dad marry my mom was because my great-great-great-grandfather's great-great-grandfather was Dr. James McHenry. And he met George Washington during the Battle of Bunker Hill because he set up a field hospital in Cambridgeport. And then he ended up on Washington's staff through the Revolutionary War. And then he was assigned halfway through to be on Lafayette's staff. And after Valley Forge. And he had been a prisoner of war during the Revolutionary War, things like that. And he ultimately is in the Continental Congress, signs the U.S. Constitution, and then Washington appoints him as, I think, the second or third Secretary of War in his early administration. And then James McHenry is under Adams, is able to get Congress to appropriate money for a standing army. And so he was one of the as Secretary of War, he's the founder of the U.S. military. And then he commissioned a fort be built in Baltimore, and then it got named after him, called Fort McHenry. So it's interesting because ultimately the descendants of Dr. James McHenry were not so warlike. Oddly enough, they were mostly into being Episcopal ministers and that kind of thing, So it's a fascinating thing that in that generation. But then my grandfather's side, he's from the other grandfather, my mom's side. His people before him were like U.S. Congress people. And I don't know what wars were happening, probably voting for the war against Mexico, things like that. So he didn't really come from a military background, but the fact that he was his parents were connected to power. So his grandfather was Carl Vanderpool, who was an inventor, and then his other grandfather invented shoe sizes and had factories, and then they were often the Phelan side. My grandfather's, they were in the U.S. Congress and stuff like that. But they did have this ideology that they were superior. So part of, I think, the thing that was going on with my mother's father, because he said, like, the reason that we're in charge of who lives and who dies, he calling it white man's burden, is because we are genetically superior to everyone else. And so so that's why we have this horrible responsibility of directing the course of the world. And so that's also interesting, that it's like a burden. It's like not really an honor, but it's a thing that we have to do. And so we're really victims of this whole system, and that's just where we are. It's our job to defend the system, and in a sense, he's right. He's like when you're killing all those people, and you're in the OSS, and then you're connected to the Central Intelligence Agency, which he was after World War II. You're a mid-manager. You're a manager for power, for empire. You're not really. They're rewarding you with good money and things like that, but they're not. You are working for somebody else, basically. Then when I was staying in Needham, before my first freshman year in high school, I had like a little room in his basement, and next to my bed were these two filing cabinets. And the filing cabinets, according to my grandfather, were payment for work he did for some scientists at MIT. That's what he called them, scientists at MIT. And in them was all this, the formulas that he then sold to Ken Olsen to start Digital Electronics. So Digital, a major defense contractor, it just showed, even back in the 60s, Digital was going to be part of the police state intelligence direction. And you see that today with like Palantir and, not even IBM in World War II, both fighting, participating in both sides of the conflict, things like that. So then years later, when I have a graphic design company in Boston, this guy comes in and he wants me to design something he's invented a computerized lathe, and he wanted a product slick for that. And it turned out that his father was Ken Olsen. And I thought that was very weird. So I had sublet at that time this office space in the front on Beacon Street, 636 Beacon Street. And to these people that just sat at these computers and said hello all day long. It was like a weird thing. Now with AI and artificial intelligence and all the things like that, it turns out that's really what they were doing. They also evicted me from my own office, which gives me the impression they had ties to intelligence in some way, and because that's pretty wild that they would do such a thing when they weren't the subletters. They were subletting for me. But they had ties to the owner of the building and got rid of me. My grandmother, my mom's mom, was Shanty Irish, and she grew up in Dorchester, and her parents died during the Spanish flu, and she was voted most beautiful woman of Dorchester High. So all these rich people would court her, including Fitzy, and our family story was that Fitzy came up and honked the horn for her to come down to go on the date. And so she did. And when she got home, her guardians were like, "You'll never go out with that dandy again. He wasn't a gentleman and should have come to the door and asked for your hand there. So, right? So apparently a bunch of rich people were trying to, were courting her because she was the most beautiful woman. But she, she's like Irish Catholic. She stayed Irish Catholic to her death. And, but my grandfather flew her and my mom to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. Now, if you're like Irish Catholic, the last thing you want to do is go see the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. But, that's kind of what they're the idea of being Protestant and being, of this line of people who control the world, genetically, that was super big, important aspect of my grandfather's personality. And he was upfront about it, Yeah. My sister, Dolly, she was in an exchange program, for like where you go and stay in a family's house somewhere. So she stayed in a family's house in Indonesia. The father was the general doing the genocide of East Timor, and we would get calls from him every Christmas, and it was just weird knowing that he was, he'd say, "Merry Christmas, Keith," and he'd send me some Indonesian shirt. And, and my dad was all excited that he would call and we'd all, for Christmas. And this guy was killing Catholics in East Timor I think he killed maybe 500,000 people, Christians, so we're celebrating Christmas with this guy. Wow. Before Food Not Bombs, I was involved in this organization called Mobilization for Survival, and they had like a committee, the Boston Alliance Against Registration in the Draft. And I actually participated with the people from the BARD, as we called it, in going up to Seabrook Nuclear Power Station to protest in the October 6, 1979 action and so on. And so I was pretty tight with this small group of people. And then as the draft, registration for the draft was growing closer, and we had all these plans where we're going to print up all these flyers, and we'll have a table at all the high schools in Cambridge and some of the main ones in Boston, and try to encourage people to not sign up for selective service. Well, right before that is about to happen, one of my friends, announced that they didn't have any money for the printing because she had bought a first-class round-trip ticket for Daniel Ellsberg, so that we need to have a rally at the Boston Commons for Ellsberg to speak at. And so that would be really, really great. At the same time, for almost a year, it started out, we had about 100 people come to every meeting, and it kept getting smaller and smaller. And so here it is, maybe a month out. We don't have the money anymore to print stuff. And we have this rally that we didn't agree to do. I don't even know if we ever had the rally in the end. I'm pretty sure we never did have it. And then, and so my friend Frank Afflitto and myself, we thought, why don't we call all these people on our phone list and find out why they're not coming to our meetings? And so we call a bunch of them, and they say, what we didn't like was we're against war, but while we were waiting to get the meeting started, there was always a group of people talking about getting guns for the revolution. So we're like, why don't we do this? Why don't we call everybody back and say, that was just, we're just joking, and we're going to stop doing that, and please come back to our meetings because, crunch time is here. And so then they were going to have a vote on that, the next meeting. So we come to the next meeting, and there's about 10 new people at the meeting who had never been to any other meetings. And they voted to block our decision and just to go forward with joking about guns for the revolution. So then I go outside to post posters and for whatever it was we're going to do, and I get immediately arrested. But Frank's in the office while watching the woman who spent the money on on Ellsberg's flight, call the police to have me arrested outside. So then we go, well, this group seems to be over. Why don't we start another group called AWOL? And so we borrowed the Clamshell Alliance office in Central Square. That office was in a church in Harvard Square. And at the first meeting, the people from the Boston Alliance Against Registration of Drafts showed up with rebar and tried to beat the crap out of us. And so we have this massive fight in this room, trying to push them out and everything. And there ended up being no further protests against the draft after that. So that was like when I realized that because also we were having issues with the FBI infiltrating the groups working against the wars in Central America, and that actually became a whole book. This Boston Globe reporter was so fascinated with the break-in to old Cambridge Baptist Church and taking all the files and so on. So this is where I'm starting to get introduced to surveillance directly. That I kind of lost my virginity on surveillance because it was weird to have been friends with these people for a year and a half, and then they're using rebar against us because we thought that you shouldn't be joking about getting guns in a peace group, That introduced me to the whole idea that's how you disrupt an organization by advocating violence, and that way you can frame people. So then with Clamshell Alliance, a bunch of us did FOIAs, and we're trying to stop the Seabrook nuclear power station. And one of my friends gets her documents back, and there had been a rumor that there was going to be, people were going to steal all these guns from this armory and show up to the October 6th protest armed, and that way they could take over the nuclear power station construction site. And we were like, that's insane. We're supposed to be dedicated to nonviolent direct action. That's crazy. So in her FOIA, this is kind of odd that she even got this document. It showed that at her apartment, there was this, she was having dinner with some of her affinity group, 3 of her affinity group fellows. And they're the ones that were talking about stealing guns from the armory. And she was like, that's stupid. We shouldn't do that. That's where the rumor starts. And it turned out, of course, the 3 people having dinner with her were in the FBI. So that becomes another early example to me of what was going on. Then in 85, I'm doing graphic design for the Boston Celtics, the Red Sox, the New England Patriots, the Bruins. I had another contract with John Delaria Hair Salon, and then I get referred to this woman, Donna Franca Franzaroli, who has a General Travel is her company, and I'm making 2 travel brochures, 36-page full-color travel brochures. And as a young graphic designer, I'm like, this is my biggest full-color jobs, and that was like, because you're doing offset printing and so on. And there were going to be like basically 500,000 copies total of these brochures. And what it was all expense-paid trip to Palermo, Italy. At the height of the mafia wars in Palermo, but I didn't put 2 and 2 together. And so while I was working for her, designing these 2 brochures, so she would lease a jet, and these people from the Midwest who would buy these travel packages would be the passengers with their luggage. And they'd land in Zurich or Rome, and then they spend a week in Palermo. And I would hear during the 30 days that I'm meeting with her to make these brochures, the people calling up very angry about their stay in Palermo, that they couldn't go outside the hotel because it was people shooting machine guns and bombing stuff. And it was like, how come you didn't warn us that that the vacation would be in the middle of a war, mafia war? And she would just tell him to screw off. And during that same 30 days, the governor of Massachusetts, who was running for president of the United States, Michael Dukakis, would come in and visit with us. And he visited with us twice for about 30 minutes each time, talking about the symphony and things like that. So then I finished the job, and I go to get the final payment, and she refuses to pay me the final payment. And then I start getting death threats, and the thing gets real heavy duty. And so in the end, I had to go underground with my wife and just hide. And I gave up all my business and everything. People broke into my business before this happened and stole all my files. And the final straw was on December, I think about 16th or 17th. I was supposed to do an interview with the boss, with a WGBH radio, on the struggle that we're doing to defend the homeless in Kenmore Square, which is where my office was and where my apartment was. And they said, well, we're going to come over to interview you, but we got these calls that you're going to be killed. What's that about? I go, oh, don't worry about that. And then I get a call from the reporter from the Boston Phoenix, who ends his conversation with the same question: what's these calls about you being going to be killed? So that's when I realized that I better leave, and that's when my wife and I disappeared. But probably if you've got the connection between, turns out Whitey Bulger, who people know of as a double agent with both the FBI and the mob, was part of this whole matrix of events. So there was potentially, although I don't have any proof of it, that the FBI, in coordination with Donna Franco Franzaroli and them, this was a way of eliminating this protest against the gentrification, which I know is not a very big deal, but and they never ultimately really gentrified that neighborhood anyway. But also, that I was willing to stand up to the mob because I refused to give her the artwork until she paid. And that was millions of dollars worth of business that I was interfering with. So I got indicted and so on for that. And her boyfriend was the district attorney. And she, while we're waiting for a hearing in my criminal trial, well, first he threatened to kill my lawyer on a speakerphone. And my lawyer dropped me instantly in the middle of the conversation. And then I, in court waiting for the judge to come in, he explained how there's no death penalty in Massachusetts, and he could have me killed in prison, because a lot of guys need favors in prison, or he has people that outside that don't want to go to prison that can kill me. So whichever way, you're going to be killed. And we're waiting for the judge to come into this, and he's the district attorney. So, or maybe probably assistant district attorney. But, so there was this elaborate connection between the county legal system and Donna Frank and the mafia. And the FBI's already been hassling me for, on and off a little bit before. They intimidated my private mailbox people at one point, and those kind of things. So that was the Boston era of the most dramatic parts of whatever surveillance was occurring. I mean, there was another case where we were having a protest. It was Cambridge City Council and Food Not Bombs were going to have a march for nuclear disarmament to Draper Lab, the weapons lab that inspired the name Food Not Bombs. So I'm learning offset printing, and I'm all excited that I've got this 2-color poster. Maybe it was really a 1-color poster. But anyway, I brought him to Cambridge City Council, and the woman at the desk goes, "Oh, wow, a nice man from the CIA came by looking for you." I was like, "Really?" So I went to the bar across the street, Plow and Stars, and looked in the white pages for CIA. Well, they don't have a phone number. And so then I was like, man, I've got to head this off. This doesn't sound safe. So I made an appointment to meet with the president of Draper Lab, General Duffy. And I met with him and stuff like that. Nothing ever really happened of it. But I thought that was interesting that it's my understanding the CIA was not supposed to be working in the U.S. against domestic protests, particularly ones organized by a city government and a citizen group like Food Not Bombs. When I refused to give back the artwork, the Donna Franco-Franzaroli sent over Terry the Nun to my office. And Terry said, look, you've got to give the artwork back immediately or by 5 o'clock, but if you don't give it back by 5, then we're going to send 2 people over to kill you. So I got all my friends together with rebar and baseball bats and stuff, and all hiding in my office for when the 2 guys came, and I sat in a place where I could get out of the way of bullets right away, but it'd be enough to track them into the room so then we could beat the crap out of them, right? That was our theory. Nobody came. And then, the district attorney threatening to kill my lawyer. That's like another hint. But an interesting aspect of all this is Veronica, who was the Donna Franco-Franzaroli's assistant, came to meet me and my wife, Andrea, and explain what was going on. So she said, look, I think you're such a lovely couple, but you'll never see me again. My husband and I are going to disappear. But one of my jobs is to translate everything on the phone, all the wiretaps, into Italian. He says, you need to know what's going on with, what you really were involved with, which was designing brochures to get Midwestern seniors to fly on these planes and as a cover, because the jets were actually carrying drugs and money and guns back and forth between Sicily and the United States. And there's a multi-million-dollar project, and that's why it's such a serious matter that you disrupted her project, because back then you had to book four-color offset presses and buy tons of paper all in advance. It was not like a straightforward thing. So she'd already had to invest probably $100,000 just into setting up the printing and everything. As it turned out, she stiffed a lot of people. That was not only me, but also other printers and so on. So that was just her MO, because she assumed that that's how you make a lot of money, is you don't pay people, and that you pay the right people, like Michael Dukakis. And so I thought, what an interesting way to do illegal gun and drug running, is to have these people from them. She probably had somebody at Border and Customs on her payroll, and both in it. And she was, and according to her, she was not allowed to go to Italy because she'd be in prison for sure. If she returned, and she eventually dies in Boston or in New England, and at a little over 100. She's 100 years old when she dies. But the other thing that was fascinating was that my contact for the sports calendars and the sports stuff. I remember one day in about July, he comes in, Steve, and he goes, you got to get ready to do. We need to start planning the World Series and American League pennant artwork. And I'm going, but it's only July. Who's going to be in the World Series? And he goes, it'll be the Red Sox will be in the World Series, and they're going to lose in the World Series in the last game. And Bill Buckner is a very famous story. There's even movies made about him missing the ball and losing to the Mets. And he used to always try to get me to give him a discount on all of his jobs, giving me either the point spread in the Celtics games or, those kind of things. And I get the impression that one of the reasons that the mafia started hiring me for this was because they knew I was an anarchist and I was off the book. So I didn't, when I was first arrested as like 18 or whatever in Portland, Oregon, my lawyer, court-appointed lawyer, suggested I jump bail and disappear because I would do 7 years in the county jail. So I did. I never used my Social Security number again. And then I went and got one in 2000. So I lived most of my life without a Social Security number. So if you're the mob and you're also connected to the government and everything, you go, wow, this guy is like a good bet. He's not going to turn us in or anything like that. We can work with him because we don't have to report taxes because he's not going to report taxes and all that. So that's why, I had 90,000 Celtics calendars on 90,000 walls in New England for several years. So I never even had to show a portfolio. I just had jobs. And I was like, and then I won the Clio Award through my connection to his wife, which was not necessarily a wife, but she ran the marketing for a hair salon company that was huge. They had the first computerized haircuts and stuff like that, And I had an ad every month in Mademoiselle, Vogue, and Elle, and all that, and I won the Clios for those, and and her father was the head of the New York City mob. So anyway, that's this mafia, FBI, CIA connection. I got to see, in a certain sense, like up close in front in my Boston years. So then I moved to after I was, underground, we were getting down to our like last $2,000 or something like that. I come to San Francisco and we figure out a way to rent an apartment and so on. And we just have regular jobs. I was working for a typing company called Bob's Typing. And, on Gary Boulevard. And this woman comes in, this very attractive woman, and she wants her resume typed. And she wants me to take out her Peace Corps work. And she wants a cover letter for the president of KCBS Radio looking for a job. So on her resume, from some date to present, she was the head, like the commander of military intelligence for the Pacific Rim. She also got an undergraduate degree in information extraction at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. She got her graduate degree in information extraction at Fort Ord in Monterey, California. And she... And so I type this all up and print out the copies for her and everything. And then later on, she becomes a reporter for KCBS Radio. I have a photograph of her interviewing me when I'm in a Santa's costume because I used to wear a Santa's costume when I thought the cops would beat the crap out of me at protests. And but anyway, so she starts interviewing me, like when I took over abandoned houses for Homes Not Jails, she would come in and the whole time I'm thinking, this is so weird that I know her, I typed her resume, she's military intelligence, but why is she also, she's using her job as a reporter as a, as a thing. So cover. A funny thing I was just writing, but today's the anniversary of Jimmy Carter trying to free the hostages in Iran. And that's also that same day, there was a huge protest in front of the Pentagon, which I was at. And I was temporarily arrested and my girlfriend was arrested. When I went to find my girlfriend at the court she was taken to, I went to the wrong place. And that's where Ellsberg and the Berrigans and everybody were being held. So I took them down to DuPont Circle in a borrowed van from the protest movement. But so it's hard to say. And it could be that that's part of the reason that he agreed to have first-class round-trip tickets to Boston, allegedly for his daughter's graduation. but knowing that that was going to absorb all the money from our group and therefore make it impossible for us to really go forward with our protests. So it's not, it could well be. It's amazing. So, it's just incredible so imagine you have this woman come. Why was this woman, who's the head of military intelligence for the Pacific Rim, having a resume typed by me? Don't they have computers that are even better at the Presidio military base? And doesn't she have an assistant that can type them? That was a really bizarre thing. But then also, there was right at that moment, in like 87, when I first arrived in San Francisco, there was this news story about these children at the daycare center being, at the Presidio, being molested. And so her employee under her is Michael what's his name? Santos. He was a Church of Set. And he was taking the kids from the daycare center on the base and doing satanic rituals with them, or potentially MK Ultra type things. And I thought, what a weird thing that she's getting a resume typed by me, but her employee, which was in the news at the time, was free and not in prison or anything for this, molesting kids at a daycare center. So, and then there was also in the San Francisco Chronicle stories about how it was common that military intelligence was responsible for the daycare centers and schools on U.S. military bases. And so what was that all about? Very strange thing. And the Church of Set had a phone number in the white pages in San Francisco. And I called it up to see what was going on when I was reading this thing, and no one ever got back to me, but you could leave a message with the church. And I just thought, what a crazy, crazy thing. So, after that, when Brian Wilson, the veteran, was doing this action at Nuremberg called Nuremberg Action, protesting the arms shipment to El Salvador from, in Concord Naval Weapons Station in Concord, California. And he got hit by a train and his legs were severed. And I had fed him, or not fed him, I fed a protest where he was doing Fast for Peace with Duncan and all the same people in Boston years ago. And we had this big meeting. Should we bring, and asked them, it says, is it rude to bring food to a fast, And he goes, well, we're the ones fasting. The other people aren't fasting, so do it. So I kind of had this, association with him. And so I was mortified by that. So then Andrea and I go out to that Saturday, there's a big protest at the tracks. And we go out to the tracks, to the protest. And on the way back to our car, we see all these people tearing up the tracks. So we're standing there looking at that and go, wow, that's really interesting. And then, then we're back home and we were watching back then they had ABC, NBC, and CBS. And if you had cable, you could watch CNN. But that just as cable started. So anyway, we had analog, and then nothing. That's what we watched. And there's in the foreground is Andrea and I, and we look kind of like we're directing the tearing up of the tracks. So Andrea turns to me and she goes, "Man, you should just start doing Food Not Bombs again." So I go, "Oh, that's a good idea." So while at Bob's typing, I would go for my lunch break and I'd pick up bagels at House of Bagels and whatever produce at Tom's Natural Food. And I'd take it to Glide Memorial Church in St. Anthony's. And so I started doing that for a while. And then I started testing where to serve the food. And eventually, while I'm doing some food at UN Plaza, these two young people that just graduated from college at College Park, Maryland, had studied 60s. No, they got their degree in the 60s, right? And so they were all excited about that. So then we agree that we just, we have a meeting. We decide we'll just serve food at the corner of Haight and Stanton at the entrance to Golden Gate Park on Mondays, because there was food that was served, by the Haight-Ashbury Soup Kitchen Tuesday through Friday, and there were two churches serving, but no food on Monday. So then anyway, I end up, so we set up, and then we end up, this nice man comes by, a hippie, real long hair and stuff. And he said, "Oh man, you can get a permit. Just write a letter to Peter Ash at Rec and Park." So we do. And then the police would come by each Monday and ask us about our permit. And then I would go down to the Parks Department office and ask about it. Nobody there had heard anything about it. And then on August 15th, 1988, riot police come out and arrest me and 8 other people. And there's a photo of the riot police blocking the food, which makes it into the Chronicle across all the columns on the top of like page 3 or something like that. And so people are upset about that. So then we have another march down the street the next Monday. And it turns out, according to FOIA documents I ended up receiving, that the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force was witnessing this arrest of, I think it was 24 people on August 22nd. And on the 29th of August, they send a memo to the FBI field office saying that we were a credible national security threat. So that Thanksgiving, people went home for the holidays and they were wearing the Food Not Bombs button. They're like, back in those days, we wore like these bigger buttons, like inch buttons, so it's easy to see. And they'd be standing there waiting to get on a plane, and a National Guard person would come up and say, "Oh wow, we just studied them in our domestic terrorism class. That Food Not Bombs is one of America's most hardcore terrorist groups." This is in Thanksgiving of '88, and 14 people shared similar stories. And then later on, I ran into people who same thing happened to them. Like I have a friend Vincent in Pittsburgh. He didn't even know there was a Food Not Bombs group or anything. He was wearing the button, and a guardsman told him this story, and he just bought the button because he liked the message, you know? And so that I found was interesting. Then years later, in April of 2009, I'm on a speaking tour, and I was speaking at Princeton, and I come back to the house that they put you up in there, this like fancy place, and it was funny because the woman that welcomed me said, "Oh yeah, you got room 7 or whatever it was. That's where Condoleezza Rice stayed last week." And they have all these remote control things, and it's in a colonial era building that had a plaque out it, George Washington slept here or whatever, you know. And so figure out how to use the TV, and there's a C-SPAN lecture. And this guy is talking, and I could tell it was Tufts University and it was State Department, but I never really got his name. And he is comparing the people that serve the vegan meals in the park to the people who, to Al-Qaeda, who's more dangerous. And at the end, he says, you know, the people serving the vegan meals are like indigenous to their community. They're really friendly and happy people and inviting with their vegan meals. Whereas Al-Qaeda, you know, they'll probably last another 30 years, but Al-Qaeda won't even last 20 years because it's not very popular to strap bombs on yourself and blow yourself up. And he said the reason that the vegan meals are more dangerous is because they are promoting this idea that money should be diverted from military spending to healthcare, education, and other social services. So a few days later, I'm speaking at Harvard Law, and then I go hang out at my dad's place, and I turn on his little TV in his guest room, and it's C-SPAN, and it's the same lecture. And at that exact moment, I was like, wow. But seeing it twice, I realized that was real. I wasn't hallucinating, But I was in the middle of a FBI operation myself at that moment, so I was like really having a hard time. I should have asked for the video. I should have just immediately called up C-SPAN and bought a copy of the video. It would have been amazing. But I was being distracted because I had gotten a grant from Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream to open this place in Taos, New Mexico called the Taos Peace House and Info Shop. And we rented a little adobe house on the main street, and we had signs out in front of it, and it was very popular. But while I was on tour, I hired somebody to help run the house and to help manage my tour. And she was sabotaging my tour. I was supposed to get books somewhere, but she never mailed them there. She said that she mailed them by accident to the wrong place. I stopped getting mail. I wasn't getting any mail for about a year. I would mail you a book. This is before I went on tour. I'd send you a book that you ordered, a T-shirt or something that would never get there. And I had no idea why nothing ever got anywhere. And so then, and then I would show up to a venue to speak, and they had never heard me coming. Yet my assistant kept insisting that I'd booked the event, and they were all excited to see me and so on. So at one point, I'm getting calls from the emergency room in Taos, like, why is the ambulance going to your property to get people that are injured? And then another friend of mine said, well, we were going to go down there and volunteer, but it was so scary, we decided that we wouldn't do that. And then the woman I was hired was, oh, no, everything's going really great here, you know? So at one point, after I had a website, you know, Peace House Info Shop website, so I put on the index page, I said, look, we're going to shut down the Peace House for a while, but, in December, we'll make a decision to reopen. So I come back in December, and there's a meeting. We had a regular meeting, and I'm at it, and two people came with like tape, with tape recorders, put it on the table, and a bunch of the people at the meeting had never participated in the Peace House the whole time I was operating it, and they said I made my assistant cry, and therefore and then I hacked the website, and I had to give them the password to the website and all this stuff, and it was like really intense. So I was dealing with that crisis while I was on tour as it was evolving. So I never ended up getting that video. But then I just gave up the Peace House at that point because it was just too crazy. And it turned out they were selling heroin out of the front door. That was what the problem was. And my assistants let a heroin ring operate out of it. And that's when people getting mad about their interactions with these people. And so anyway, I ended that. And so it was really pretty intense that happened. But I went for years without getting, a year at a time sometimes without getting any mail. And I contacted Senator Lujan's office about that. Why wasn't I not getting mail? And why were people not receiving my mail? And the staff person responsible for postal matters accidentally tells me, they said, oh yeah, the FBI has been confiscating your mail. And so I asked her to repeat that, and she's like, oh, no, I can't say anything more. The other weird thing was that on that tour, I had mailed $4,500 in honorariums to the Food Not Bombs bank account in New Mexico. But the money never arrived. So then it became time for the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention. I had intended to go to both and join in the protest. But I had no money because it just disappeared. I still had the account, but no money in the account. So I hitched to the Denver protest, and but I couldn't get to the Minneapolis protest. So then in Minneapolis, the FBI raids the Food Not Bombs house, and they arrest 8 people, Food Not Bombs people, who are the RNC 8 is what people know them as. And it turns out there's a woman that had joined Food Not Bombs in the months before, and she ends up at some point she stops coming to Food Not Bombs about the same time as the Democratic National Convention, and the RNC is after that, maybe a couple of weeks or a month later. And she ends up popping up in these news articles as called Anarchist Mom in the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Turned out she was with the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department narcotics agent, and her supposed cousin was another sheriff agent, and that they were attending the meetings. And the weird coincidence is she looks exactly like my ex-wife. Now, my ex-wife I met her like in a singles page when I was working for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, and when then there's a whole lot of FBI stuff around that, I can tell you. And then anyway, I had this, I started going out with her, and at that time I was the graphic designer for Current News, which was Kansas City's premier drag queen magazine, and I was getting paid cash to do it, and that's how I got out. I was homeless actually after the Peltier Defense Committee shut down, and I got off the streets about a month, 2 months, because I scored this job. And so I was only people I knew in Kansas City by this time were was drag queens, and they're really fun and everything. But then I thought, well, I should try to meet somebody outside the drag queen committee. So I had an ad in the pitch, and this woman, I connect with her and stuff, and we start dating. And then she had a condo that was real cheap, and we traveled a lot and stuff. And then we moved out to Arizona at some point. We saw the condo because there was a big dispute between her and another neighbor in the condo. And I ended up getting valley fever and fibromyalgia. And at the same time, I'm the graphic designer for United Way of Tucson and Southern Arizona. And 9/11 happens. And that we all have to stop what we're doing at United Way and just organize, to get money for the New York City United Way and stuff. And then my boss comes to me and says, "Oh, we have to let you go. Our largest customers want us to fire you." And what kind of started that is I got asked to serve food at Raytheon Missile Systems protests. And I went to the HR and I said, "Look, I've been invited to serve food at the protests against Raytheon, which I know is our largest client, and but I don't need to show if that's going to cause United Way some problems. But just know that Food Not Bombs would be there serving food, and I don't want to be surprised about that." So then they had to fire me from that job. Then I got another job. They fired me pretty quickly. And then the third job after that, the woman says, "Oh, I received a phone call that you're on a blacklist and you're not allowed to work in the United States. So I have to let you go, even though you're doing a great job." So I never got a paid job after that again. And I'd only gotten my Social Security number like in 2001. So I only got to use it for or 2000 maybe. And when this woman I had married, insisted I do it so I could get Social Security and stuff. And then she ended up demanding a divorce because she was afraid that the government will take the house because of 9/11. And so why don't we just put it in her name only? And then once this crisis blows over, then we'll get remarried and all will be well. And but instead, one day she says, "Look, you're out of here." And I was super sick. I had the fibromyalgia and valley fever and really suffering. And so she says, "I put everything in your truck. You're out of here. I never want to see you again." As I end up homeless and losing everything, even though I'm the one that restored the house. I'm the one that, actually found the house and all that. So I've always wondered who she was, because that was really devastating. And then the fact that a woman that looked just like her was publicly a honey, was in the group. And she was my age. And the people in Food Not Bombs were always thinking, why is this old lady here? And her thing was that I'm really down to dumpster diving and I really hate George Bush, and it seemed really fake. They thought it was fake and they thought, what's this old lady coming to our meetings? And then it turns out that that's why. So I was lucky that the FBI took all my money so I couldn't get to this honey trap, and who knows what might have happened. And I might have been in the house when the terrorism raid happened and all that. And fortunately, no one got convicted of anything. It was all, I think one guy got convicted of tipping over a newspaper rack, and that was the entire thing. But, makes big headlines. Then I we get sabotaged a lot. I would say that another interesting FBI operation was we decided to have the Food Not Bombs World Gathering in New York City at the same time as the Republican National, whatever it's called,
2004?
Yeah, 2004 in New York City, Manhattan, and for their convention, the Republican National Convention. And so we do a lot of work. We secure some places for it in New York City. And I went through New York City. I was going with this filmmaker, Liz Tadage, touring Food Not Bombs around North America. And she was going to do a documentary on Food Not Bombs. And so we are at Thompson Square hanging out with the Food Not Bombs kids and cooking with them and everything. And I bring up this idea, why don't we do a world gathering here? And they're like, yeah, this is really great. And then but I'd already been to, maybe I hadn't said that originally. I was where it really starts is I'm in Richmond, Virginia, Food Not Bombs. And one of the people at Richmond, Virginia, Food Not Bombs says, we got to do another world gathering like the 95 gathering because that was so successful. So that's where Indie Media was born, was at the 95 Food Not Bombs gathering in San Francisco. And that was an amazing event. There's a great documentary by Ficklin. I forget his first name. But anyway, so we had in that gathering, we had squatting. We took over abandoned property at the Presidio. We had a pirate radio station. We taught people how to make FM radio transmitters. We had all these amazing workshops, and there was there was like 130 rests, maybe 134 rests for serving food. About 1,000 people went through the Convergence Center, and it was like this amazing event. So he thought we should do this again. And so I had the backup in Manhattan, and I would suggest that to them. And they were like, oh, yeah, this is really great. So then I had a school bus. I lived back in those days. I eventually named it Katrina because it went to Katrina. But so we're going to go across America on 70 and pick up Food Not Bombs activists in Denver and first in Albuquerque, then Denver, and then, Lawrence, Kansas, and so on. We had this whole thing scoped out. And after Albuquerque, we go up to, we had to change like a fuel pump or something in Colorado Springs, and we call up the people at the Food Not Bombs house and say, well, we're running a little late. And they are like real sketchy, man. They're like, oh, don't come. We decide not to go. But no explanation. We get to Lawrence, same thing. No, we decide not to go. And no one went on the trip. And it turned out that what I did not know was another organization started up in Manhattan called Anarchist Burritos. And they started this huge fight with the local Food Not Bombs, and and it got so bad they decided not to have the World Gathering. But then I'm not knowing that. I'm on my way there to have the World Gathering. And then there's another guy is in Richmond Food Not Bombs and starts a huge fight there. And then they start having fights. The two groups start fighting each other, and so there really is no gathering by the time we get there. So later on, I end up talking to the ACLU in Denver, and they had done Freedom of Information Act requests and got a bunch of documents showing how the FBI went to all these houses, the Lawrence Food Not Bombs house, and they threatened them and asked them questions. Plus, I think on the way across, when I talked to them, people mentioned that they were visited by the FBI, but they didn't want to say anything because it was, they were freaked out. So that sabotaged that gathering. So then I end up, we decide, why don't we do another gathering in Philadelphia during the biotech trade conference, and a friend of mine, Brian Tokar, was organizing. And so we organized this gathering. And oddly enough, right before the big rally, somebody takes my giant banner, it just disappears, and I never see it again. And big Food Not Bombs banner we're going to take there. And then there was a woman, a medic named Sarah, who was hanging out with us, with me and Ren and Zachary and Eric McDavid. And so we're sleeping on a porch of one of the Food Not Bombs houses in Philadelphia. And at some point I go out and I buy them beer because all seems to be relatively disrupted, but to be expected, right? Then later on, I find out like Eric and Ren and Sarah and Zachary, they're in a car, in Sarah's father's car, driving across America to Auburn, which is where Eric was from, Auburn, California. And they're at supposedly Sarah's father's ski lodge in the Sierras. And all of a sudden there's helicopters and SWAT teams and everything raid the house. And and Ren and Zachary and Eric get arrested. And they get charged with terrorism and plotting to bomb banks and dams and things like that. And it turns out Sarah was an informant. And there's an expose in Elle magazine about her infiltrated, where she brags about how her whole path to framing them. Eric ends up they pit Zachary and Ren against each other and against Eric. So Ren, it seemed to be my impression that Ren really would have liked to have been a girlfriend of Eric's. But here you had Sarah in the way. And I always thought there's something wrong with Sarah because she seemed real mean. In fact, when I met Sarah at the RNC protest, she came by the table and was real nasty. And then there ended up being an FBI report that I had 24 slingshots on my table that were going to be used against the police. Of course, this was the Berkeley long haul magazine called Slingshot. They were not slingshots. And anyway, it turns out that the whole thing was a setup, and he gets 19 years in prison for terrorism. And thankfully, his friends, and I was trying to get across to his original attorney that he would not be the first Food Not Bombs person framed by the FBI on terrorism charges, and that they had to, come at the defense from that point of view. So eventually they do come across the fact, withheld documents from the FBI, making it clear the entire plot was a fabrication by the FBI. The first time a Food Not Bombs activist was charged on terrorism by the FBI was Connor Cash in about 2000. And he was accused of burning down some model homes in a area on the Connecticut, Sound, and only because he was doing his literature included a protest against this development ruining this ecological system, and his family lived right by there, so it made sense. But he got framed, and he ended up spending like a couple of years defending himself. And fortunately never got convicted, but they had to put their house up for, mortgage, for their second mortgage to pay for the defense and so on. Another case that was the Cleveland Five so the cooks that occupied Cleveland, 3 of them were in Food Not Bombs and 2 were, cooks. And the FBI, according to their criminal complaint, had an informant who was this African-American guy who claimed he was like a black Muslim activist. And then he had a handler, which was the actual FBI agent who would periodically come by to make sure everything was happening. And it turned out the informant was getting like a reduced sentence and so on. And so they in the complaint, they even analyzed who is the most likely to frame. And then they got the Food Not Bombs kids and they evolved this their plot, so they keep getting, they're trying to talk them into bombing something, and eventually they try to get, and they're young, they were too young to buy beer, which is part of the, that the informant would buy them beer, and let them crash in an apartment in the middle of the winter that he was a manager of, which he and that happened a bunch. There's a bunch of managers of apartments that let Occupy activists crash in them, who turned out that they were not who they said they were. But anyway, on just the evening of right before May Day, one of the FBI people hands the phone. I guess it's the African American guy, hands the phone to one of the Food Not Bombs kids and say, "Hey, if you dial this, I've already put explosives under the bridge and it'll blow up and you'll be a hero for May Day," and so on. And the poor kid stupidly does it. And then all 5 of them get entrapped. And he did, I don't know if he did the whole 10 years, but all 5 of them were sentenced to 10 years in prison. And so those are like kind of 2 classic FBI frame-ups of, or 3 really, of Food Not Bombs activists. And with FOIA documents, you see tons and tons of stuff. But an interesting thing is I've been trying to do a lot of FOIA, and I have a really good FOIA expert that helps me. Property of the People is this project, and it's Ryan Shapiro and Jeffrey, God, I forget his name right now. But anyway, they we've been trying to get the Taos documents. We have nothing on Taos. It goes right up to my time when I'm taking off an airplane. I went from Istanbul to Heathrow to Chicago, and I got pulled off the plane in Chicago, and I was brought to this room by Border and Customs, and they were asking me and my friend Lori, well, she was on one side of the room, so I don't really know what they asked her, but for me, they asked how I was connected to the violent group Food Not Bombs. They kept saying that, and so on. And then there was this guy in a sports coat and tie that was sitting behind the computer where the Border and Customs woman was, and he'd go, "What about that fire in Alpine? That was an amazing fire down there." And what? And he was like he was a former forest fire guy, and somehow we were buddies about forest fires. And it turned out it was an investigation. He was FBI. He never introduced himself as FBI. And but he did write a nice memo saying that Food Not Bombs was dedicated to nonviolence and all these things. It was kind of like would be good for it was positive what he said. But it turned out it was part of that investigation into Earth First activists. And one of the Food Not Bombs people, Bill Rogers, ends up getting captured after that in the Green Scare, Operation Backburn or whatever it was. And he gets charged with burning a ski lodge in Aspen. And he ends up dying in Coconino County jail and his girlfriend, I was just hanging out with them at Prescott. I mean, they had an info shop in Prescott. And his girlfriend really thinks he did commit suicide. But, I'm pretty suspicious of that. But apparently he's committed suicide on the winter solstice. That's the story. And a bunch of almost everybody in that operation had been, at one point or another, volunteering with Food Not Bombs, but then get caught up in these. One of the scandals was that they did nothing, and it was like a heroin addict that was trying to frame him in Eugene. And that caused huge problems. The Eugene activist scene collapsed for almost a decade behind that. But they were trying to burn up genetically modified, trees and things like that, and they were getting in trouble for that. But the whole time, it was again one of those things where the whole plot was by this heroin addict, and the actual people got arrested that were either just following along or had no idea they were even involved in a terrorism plot, so what they call a terrorism plot. So, there's another interesting surveillance thing is the Unfree Trade Tour. So this guy was in Berlin, and my 2 friends from San Francisco were doing I was facing 25 to life in prison in San Francisco, and they were doing an information event in a cafe in Berlin, and this guy happens to just be there. And so he connects with them, and they takes my 2 friends, Michael and Heineke, over to Spain, because he's supposed to be like this Basque very important Basque activist in Spain. And he does a couple of press conferences with them and about my plight of my case and everything. And Michael and them come back to San Francisco, and they have these newspaper clippings from their tour in my behalf with this man by the name of Manolo. And they said, well, Manolo would love for you to do is going to translate your book into Spanish, my first book, Food Not Bombs, How to Feed the Hungry and Build Community, or How to Build a Community and Feed the Hungry, whatever. But anyway, so he, so I agreed to let them do that, and then I'm going to do a tour in Europe. And so he said, "Oh, why you also, as part of the tour, we'll have the book will be published just in time, and you can do a tour of Spain." So I do a tour of Spain with this book, and the book sadly ended up being kind of a fiasco. It was like 50 pages about how is like an anthropological book. And my book was an example of what homeless people write in America. But there was it made it really clear you weren't, these are just like these podunk people in America. It's a very interesting cultural thing, but it's not something that would ever happen in Spain. So no groups ever started as a result of that book because of the nature of the first section of it. And anyway, so he pretends like he speaks no English the whole time, which is pretty remarkable. And so he has like a little computer to have conversations back and forth with us. And he invites me he asked me if I'd organize a tour of the United States. And he's supposed to be very big in the anti-globalization movement. And I'd been going to anti-globalization protests in Europe since I think the first one I went to was 92 in Bonn, West Germany, against the EU and the Euro. That was the left was totally against the EU and the Euro. Most people are shocked that that's true, but that's who organized these protests against it. So anyway, I agreed to organize a tour, and it's called the Unfree Trade Tour. And Michael and Heineke agreed to use their school bus in San Francisco to go on the tour, and I raised money for all that. And we have these meetings at the Code Pink office, and really it was the Global Exchange office in the Mission District, and we're trying to get Global Exchange and all these other anti-globalization groups to support us. And at the last minute, there's like a problem with a squat that Heineke's in Berlin, so she's got to leave, and they can't go on the tour. So I end up going on the tour, and I have to get a vehicle and all that. So we're doing back and forth with this correspondence by fax, and I have a friend in San Francisco that's translating everything into English for me. And they, for some reason, buy a ticket to Los Angeles. And we have a press conference and an event in San Francisco the next day. It's like this crazy thing. So I go down there and we have to stay the night at a friend's house and so on. So then the tour starts going, and an unusual thing happens. We get to, like, for instance, the first stop after long haul is in, I think, Arcata. It might have been even Eugene. But we go to the house, and we afterwards, and all the Food Not Bombs activists, and they're all hanging out with the supposedly 3 anarchists from Spain. And it's about like 1:30, and there's a knock on the door, and the person is delivering a package and needs it signed. But then Seattle, same thing. We're at my friend's house after the event, and somebody comes in a UPS guy comes in the middle of the night about 1:30, and needs us to sign for a package. And this starts happening at every stop. And when we're at the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee office in Lawrence, as part of this tour, a guy knocks on the door at about 2:00, and he's a coat and tie and a measuring tape. And he's got a clipboard. And he says, I'm here I'm from the insurance company, and we have to measure the ceilings. And we're like, you're not measuring the ceilings. You're out of here, man. So that was one thing that happened. Virtually every single stop, somebody came in the middle of the night to deliver something or investigate something. Then the other thing that's happening is people are starting to tell me how come you're not feeding the people in your in your tour? And apparently Manolo, so back then you had to do this thing called telemarketing or something like that. It was like it was not like now where you can just go online and you got Wi-Fi and you email stuff. I had to set up this whole system every place we went because he was supposed to be reporting in to his collective back in Spain what was going on, and he had to be doing this. So anyway, we'd get to a house to unload our stuff, our food and everything, and the people would greet us and saying, "It's really terrible you haven't eaten in like 4 days. We made you this big feast, and I'm like, where are you getting this news? Oh, there's like a blog, like an email that comes out to everybody and it's explaining what's happening." And they seem, after a while, they're starting to get mystified, each house, because they were arriving with huge amounts of food that the last house gave us, but they're making a feast for us, and they're really upset about that we haven't fed them in all these days. And then eventually in Richmond, they go, maybe it's because when they say you're not feeding them meat. So they go out and they buy them a bunch of meat. And then, but it still happens. There's still like stories. And so so those two things were happening the whole tour. That was 60 days. And it was like, it was pretty shocking. That's in 1997, the Unfree Trade Tour. So then I go over to an anti-globalization gathering in Geneva, Switzerland, and I've got like a scrapbook, and the beginning of it is the articles from Manolo in Spain about him speaking. So there was this really cute, I was single at the time, this really cute woman from Madrid is like following me everywhere, writing down everything I'm saying and taking pictures of me, and said, "We're going to have a big story about you. This is miraculous what you're doing, blah, blah, blah." So then somebody from the Spanish, I guess a bunch of Spanish activists had all staying in the same hotel. So they come to me and they say, "We need to have a meeting with you." So I go, "Okay." And I go to the hotel, and there's like about 30 people in this room off the lobby. And they got a chair for me to sit in. And they would say, "We want to ask how you know this guy, Manolo." And I'd be like, "Yeah, well, I was on a tour and it didn't really go well. Did the word get back that the tour was terrible or something?" And they go, "You got to vet people better, man. He's the most famous Interpol agent in Spain." And one person said, "Yeah, my friend was in a group with him and she ended up in a sanitarium. It was so warped and so on." And then he had introduced me to his girlfriends at each stop on my tour with him in Spain. So the guy that helped translate, his father was the translator, and he was very active in San Francisco Food Not Bombs. And so he was very mad that I had embarrassed the Spanish delegation. And so this woman, before I go to Geneva, goes to Spain, and she's fluent in Spanish. And she visits with Manolo and goes around. And she realizes that each of these women thinks that they're married to Manolo and that they're the only wife. But one was in the anti-globalization movement. One was one of the leading Basque activists in Victoria. Another was a anti-nuclear activist, and so on. So it turns out none of the wives know that he has other wives, and she spills the beans on them. And I don't know what ultimately, because occasionally I still see Manolo in posts and stuff, but it's just really interesting. Unfortunately, Hugh Mejia, who was the one who told Sarah to go and apologize for us embarrassing the Spanish activist community, he keeps getting pressured even long after that. And he was our video guy for all the arrests in San Francisco. And then he threatens to burn all the videos, and then he's disrupting the meeting, saying we have to kick Keith out of Food Not Bombs forever and blah, blah, blah. And then eventually he says, I'm going to disappear. And and you'll never know where I am. And then he disappears, and no one knows whether he jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge or what happened to him. But a year later, I think it was might be the SF Weekly, but it might have been the San Francisco Guardian, has an article about whatever happened to Hugh Mejia. They never found a body or anything. And anyway, back in Taos, I get a letter after this meeting where we shut down the Taos Peace House, where they kicked me out of the Taos Peace House forever and so on. And it's almost word for word the same letter that kicked me out of Food Not Bombs forever that Hugh emailed and mailed a hard copy to me. And he used the San Francisco Food Not Bombs email account to say I'd been permanently kicked out and shared that all over everywhere. Very weird concept. And so there seems to be a link between that letter, which is so similar to the one I get in Taos. So this is kind of a pattern that's happening. And to me, I find there's these plays that happen all the time, that there's these patterns that the intelligence community does, and they don't have that many plays. They just keep repeating their plays over and over again, which is very interesting, I think. The first thing is to always speak from your heart and go forward and not let anything interrupt you. Just have integrity at all times. But the other thing is because this is what happened to Eric McDavid, this is what I experienced in Boston Alliance Against Registration in the draft, is when they're starting to talk about using violence and even joking, because see, that's what Sarah did with there were audio tapes of Eric McDavid and them, but the tapes were really of Sarah proposing terrorist attacks, but kind of not exactly serious maybe, but maybe serious. But the problem for Eric was very shy. And so they never spoke up. They just kind of laughed because they didn't take it seriously. So whenever you hear somebody talking about doing violence, even if it sounds like a joke, you want to be loud enough, because that was the other problem, is the audio tapes, Eric was so quiet, you couldn't pick up really what he was saying if he was not in support of whatever, or thought it was a joke or something of what Sarah was doing. So I think that's fundamental. Is like, if people are talking about violence, just speak up and say, no, that's not what I'm doing. Otherwise, you can easily be, if you're not real loud about it, you could end up facing 19 years in prison like Eric. And but you don't want to be paranoid. If you live in your truth and with dignity, then no matter what happens to you, at least you are will have like the kind of the backbone, or the feeling that you are going in the right path, the way you feel. And if you're not advocating violence and not actually organizing for a terrorist attack or something, then you could potentially still get convicted and so on. But the reality is, you don't want to create an atmosphere of paranoia. You just want actions that the informants are doing, you want to denounce as the actions and not necessarily claim that they're informants, because that will really break up an organization if you do that. So we had an interesting case in San Francisco. There was this black guy that volunteered with us, and we, like any white, mostly majority group, we were like excited to have this really enthusiastic black activist join us. But he kept parking our vans. He would volunteer to drive the van, and he'd park in a driveway, which in San Francisco is definitely you're going to be towed, right? So we lost van after van, and it usually happened before we could register, because we were serving twice a day, so we need to get our vehicles out there right away, and we'd be in the midst of trying to register the van, and then they tow the van, and I think we went through 6 vans maybe in like half a year, something like that. And so I would like say, we can't have Willie drive the van, because of this. And then somebody else in the organization would go, oh no, that would be racist if we did it. And I'm going, if it was a white guy losing our vans, we would be upset really racism to let a black guy lose our vans all the time and cause us so much trouble. Eventually, oddly enough, we're walking through the courthouse at 850 Bryant Street in San Francisco, and we see Willie on the stand. So we go in and watch, and he's a confidential paid informant, right? And I was pretty sure that was the case because when he came to my house, my dog Pluto chased him all the way down the stairs, out onto Clement Street, down to 7-Eleven, and all the way up to the coolers in the back of 7-Eleven, because he had, FBI radar apparently, and that was the only person he ever chased in the whole 15 years I had Pluto. But anyway, so that's the thing, is that they play all these games, and you don't want to claim that the kid that's defending Willie for losing the cars and saying that we can't be racist. I got the impression he definitely was FBI or an informative. See, that's the other thing. The other thing that's really interesting about intelligence operations and stuff. So one of the key aspects of trying to do in Food Not Bombs at a certain point, when Willie Brown became mayor of San Francisco, the informants infiltrated the Food Not. Eventually got to the point, because that got Hugh having a fit, and they're always talking about trying to kick me out, and people would call me, we don't even know who you are, why you are the focus of every meeting. That's all we ever talk about, is how bad you are. We don't even know who you are. We don't even know what bad thing you did, right? So eventually it breaks down to there's one person in the group, two people in the group or so. And one of the people before this happens, we had this listserv. One of the first listservs in the world online, called fnb.tau.ca. And he dominated it. He just, every 10 messages would be him. And he was advocating really strongly to stop bringing out banners and literature, and that we would feed more people if, we just brought the food. And then he's advocating we do it at night. So eventually San Francisco Food Not Bombs is serving with no banners, no literature. It's one guy. The literature is in that former informant's apartment, in a closet, as it turns out. And people would come to San Francisco Food Not Bombs to see how to do a Food Not Bombs, because it's the famous Food Not Bombs where we got arrested all those times and everything. And they would see this guy with 2 buckets of soup sitting at about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night at UN Plaza, where nobody is there. Nobody is walking by. And they would go and reproduce, thinking that's how you do Food Not Bombs. So then, Eugene Food Not Bombs is serving food at night, and with no literature, no banner. Even to this day, Portland, Oregon Food Not Bombs doesn't bring literature or anything to their meals. They just... and it's in a park in the middle of a place where no one would ever walk by or ever talk to them. I tried to find them one time, and I ended up in an anti-police brutality rally thinking that was Food Not Bombs, waiting for the meal to come. And so anyway, that strategy was really positive to undermine it. So to get to undo that, I had to make a flyer, about that and mail it to everybody. But one of the other, every time you would want to start a Food Not Bombs, I had 7 steps to starting Food Not Bombs, plus why it was important to have literature and a banner, and to do it in public in the middle of the day, or at a time when people walk by, and so on. And it took about 10 years to kind of reverse this trend that was happening. Although some groups are essentially falling into that pattern. Eugene overcame it, but some stuck with that. So then the other thing that they would do, I was in Boulder, Colorado, and they had a really good strategy there. So this girl, I'm visiting with the Food Not Bombs, and she's the new founder of the new group. And she goes, well, I heard that Food Not Bombs has a bad reputation. And it was suggested that we change the name to something like World Peas or something like that. So what would happen is that an informant, or maybe even the FBI, an FBI person, would know your pattern, knew this girl's pattern, knew she got coffee every morning at this place, and they would have these random conversations with her and try to convince her to change the name, because that was also key, to get rid of the name. So you would occasionally hear that, you'd read in like a local paper online that Food Not Bombs has changed their name to Feed Munsky, right? So there become a lot of Feed whatever the town is. Or the other one they would do is People's Kitchen or Anarchist Burrito. There's all these FBI names that are used to make sure it doesn't say the word Food Not Bombs. This is like super common. And it's also common for a totally innocent person to be approached outside of Food Not Bombs events and meals and stuff and talk to some random person that they don't know who they are, who will start to feed them a story that then becomes the direction to undermine that local Food Not Bombs group. So you could be in a Food Not Bombs group and everybody in it is innocent and nobody is an informant, but you have somebody on the outside manipulating events. And this happens, I see this all the time. It even happens here in Santa Cruz and stuff. So in many organizations that I participate in, they get undermined by the talk outside to some good-meaning people, because it's much more effective to undermine your group if a really sincere, honest person that you can't trace back to being an informant proposes with earnest whatever it is that will destroy your organization. So that's like a really common thing. So I encourage people to, watch out for that as well. There's, these are many of the plays that go on. It's pretty interesting. Occupy was interesting because I had this different perspective than almost anybody, because Food Not Bombs were in all these, helping do these kitchens. And we kind of came to an informal agreement that we would never call, say that they were Food Not Bombs kitchens, because we didn't want any kind of sectarian group, like Revolutionary Communist Party or something, to kind of hijack the Occupy. And so we didn't want to open that door to the possibility of that by identifying our kitchens as being Food Not Bombs kitchens, even though they really were. But then I got early on in Occupy, I started getting these calls from emails from Food Not Bombs activists around the country saying that they are being sued for feeding the homeless at Occupy by Occupy. And that was a pattern. And then remember when there was a shooting at Occupy Oakland on the Edge? That same day there was shooting in a bunch of Occupies across the country on the same day, which you would not know, but I would have, the kitchens would call me and they would while talking say, oh yeah, man, there was a shooting today so there was that. Then the rape, there was a week of rapes at Occupy. And I happened to, at that point, be in Tucson, and these guys had picked up these teenage girls at a party in Phoenix and raped them, and then dumped them off at Occupy Tucson, and then called the media and said, look, these girls were raped at Occupy, right? So they did that across the country. So, and then there was the massive clampdown, with the Thanksgiving clampdown and the da-da-da-da-da, So, and then we know from FOIA documents that they even were plotting to shoot the leadership and and remember, this is Obama, right? And so and then it's Obama that frames his Justice Department that frames the Cleveland Five. And my perspective on that is there was an attempt to have reoccupy on May Day. Now you've got Indivisible having their actions on May Day this year to try to co-opt what would be, make it look like it's radical, but the two things you're not going to talk about are ending the war against Russia, because they got, their thing is like hands off NATO, or because there was Zionists that started Indivisible and are funded by Zionists. You can't be saying anything against the war, the genocide in Gaza. But so there's many multi-levels where they set up like these controlled opposition. And I would say right before COVID, the controlled opposition effort started getting really, really big. And so things like, it seemed like the whole, like democracy now really started moving into a liberal democratic perspective. And probably not necessarily consciously, but definitely. So, they fell for the white helmets thing and the Syria gas thing. And that's, I think, one of the things that Aaron Mate eventually, left. But they were really into the COVID narrative to way over the top, more than, almost as much as NPR, if not more, and things like that. So you had Black Lives Matter. They figured out how to break up any kind of legitimate grassroots movement of that by, in one, giving a bunch of money to a group of people who claim to be Black Lives Matter, and then making everybody mad that why these guys now buying houses while the other people get nothing, things like that. So that's common. So almost the entire opposition that would be potentially available to organize against Trump or Biden, because that was probably the main focus. There were, end up being like shills of the Democratic Party, or just somehow controlled. So I was involved in the Poor People's Campaign, and they became just a Democratic Party front group. And it's really disappointing. But so that is so there's this mafia connection. There is the intelligence operations connection directly with three-letter agencies and so on. And then you have their connection to already controlled politics, like Democratic and Republican parties. And this is how they can maintain control and eliminate any threats to power. And then if it gets to be too big of a threat to power, like your Gaddafi, then they just kill you.